Warning, I'm a police officer and I'm about to discuss public sector employee unions. I've also worked as a substitute teacher in a public school system. So if you're the type of person who can't trust anyone who is involved with this subject material, and you'd rather listen to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, you might want to change the channel. But if you stick around, you might just hit on something interesting because you've come to take the gold pill. The two major parties in the media can no longer be expected to represent our interests. They control the information we receive in order to keep us comfortable with their profits and with their power. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more. People do not become teachers because they are lazy and dislike children. Anyone who has known young teachers and applicants right out of college knows this to be true. By the way, nor do people become cops because they dislike people and don't want to be helpful. We should probably talk about that in a different episode. But in each case, in the case of both teachers and police officers, public sector employee unions protect lazy and unlikable behavior. Why? While I do not believe there to be a serious mismatch between the type of people who aspire to teach and the attitudes required to be good at teaching, there is a serious mismatch between the attitudes required to be good at overseeing union contract negotiations and the people who aspire to be in charge, namely politicians. Politicians and people who run unions, who are in some sense politicians of a sort, have a great deal in common. They represent other people. They represent their constituents. In this sense, they're like professional associations and attorneys and trade associations. I used to work for trade associations. Their jobs are not to think outside of the box. Their jobs are to think inside of the box. There is not a serious mismatch between the people who aspire to teach and the attitude required to be good at it. Their job is to represent the interests of their members, their constituents, their clients, their students. Their job is not to restructure industries so that some clients would leave and a different batch would come in. Unions represent the here and now. They represent people who are employed now, not in the past, or that will be employed in the future. Thinking inside the box, what do current employees ask for? Broadly speaking, they ask for three things: more pay, less work, and better working conditions. So unions ask for whatever pay they can get. For any given level of pay, they ask for the lowest minimum amount of work that they can get, and for any given level of work and pay, for the best conditions they can get. And one element of optimizing those conditions is relieving the stress that employees have worrying about whether they'll be fired unfairly or fired at all, or punished unfairly or punished at all. Politicians also represent the here and now. They also think inside the box, and so often this means balancing the budget, the current budget. So it's a lot more immediately logical for politicians to haggle with unions over a pay raise than it is to haggle over issues of accountability and performance management, issues that'll get a bite over many years. Further aligning the short-term interests of unions and politicians is that unions are often very powerful politically. So a politician has plenty of reason to explain to voters their interests lie in keeping current teachers, for example, happy. Although this has largely been historically true for police officers as well, obviously it hasn't been very true most recently. So given that unions and politicians' jobs are to think inside of the box, and the political structure gives the unionized workers a great deal of political power, it's not difficult to see how such contracts evolve over time. Pay gradually increases. This attracts more qualified applicants as time goes by. And we see that in terms of increasing education requirements and the increases in the use of other screening devices that are placed on applicants in the hiring process. Protections for employees in regard to accusations of undesirable or unproductive behavior also increase over time. Short of criminal accusations, it's very difficult to fire a member of a public sector union. So if unions and politicians' jobs are to think inside the box, whose job is it to think outside of the box? Whose job is it to innovate, to restructure, to change the nature of the contract? Clearly what's needed is for politicians to demand contracts with greater transparency, greater accountability, to provide incentives for better performance and punishments for bad performance. Whose job is it to offer a new style of contract, perhaps a more expensive contract, one that reflects the municipality's willingness to pay more for employees willing to be held more accountable for their performance? Whose job is it to impose a new style of employer-employee relationship, to change the nature, maybe even the structure of the industry? By the way, this is not a trick question. Indeed, it's the same answer as in any industry. It's the job of the entrepreneur to offer innovation. But when a monopolist, like a municipality, deals with a monopsonist, one single provider of labor, like a union, there's no room for an entrepreneur. We wouldn't tolerate monopolies in other industries. Indeed, legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act reflects our recognition that monopolies are bad for the economy. We can argue over the application of that law. We can argue that the government sometimes overreaches because it succumbs to populist forces that fear big institutions. US versus Microsoft may have been one such case, as I would argue that it was, when courts ordered Microsoft to do business differently. But there can be no argument about whether monopolies are bad for the economy. No economist would argue that a monopoly were good for an industry. The only argument is whether the improvement in economic efficiency could be worth the necessary compromise of our freedom for the government to do something about it. But in the case of schools, it is the government that creates the monopolies. And the government creates monopolies in clear violation of the spirit of standing federal law. Case law makes it illegal to tie products together in an effort to exclude competition. Yet we tolerate municipalities doing exactly that when they provide funding to some schools, those over which politicians have control, but not other schools. Private schools, meaning those that meet whatever state law requirements there are to fulfill the role of a school, but not operating pursuant to a charter, are not funded by the state. How is that fair competition? The practice is not only bad economics, it should be illegal. We turn the other cheek because it's in the public sector. But there's really no excuse not to shut down tying arrangements between municipalities and schools. Bravo for the charter school programs out there that outperform and outgrow traditional public schools. While the problem in traditional public schools does seem to revolve around performance management issues, it's apparently not a matter of unionization per se. Some charter schools are unionized and some are not, but there does not seem to be much of a difference in terms of performance between these two groups. Whether they're unionized or not, charter schools outperform traditional public schools, and by wide margins. The reason for this is that the unionized charter school management has negotiated for flexibility and accountability in performance management. It turns out that the problem is not the unions, it's the politicians. By the way, the same thing holds true for police union contracts. For example, the union of which I am a part is not likely to offer up for free the idea of holding officers more accountable and yielding to the city greater flexibility to fire those who display weak performance or unwanted behavior. But if my mayor were to demand that this is what she wanted, and were to offer to pay for it in terms of higher compensation, her innovative attitude would not fall on deaf ears. Turns out that there are actually a lot more libertarian cops than there are libertarian politicians. Who'da thunk? Politicians are not libertarian by their nature because politics is not libertarian by its nature. Politics is about power, the power of the government. If there were any doubt about whether the system would drive politicians and unions to line up in favor of liberty or in favor of control, that doubt should have been erased by the debate over school closures due to COVID. In the United States, the CDC explicitly announced, after meeting with representatives of the teachers' unions, that it had not only changed its mantra of follow the science, but had done so because it had met with representatives of the teachers' unions. Truly an extraordinary admission. On some level, you have to acknowledge the chutzpah of someone who would make such an admission. By contrast, in Europe, where most countries kept schools open most of the time, the COVID pandemic hit hard. So Europe has become an important testing ground for us to examine. In places like Finland, Spain, and Germany, schools were kept open even through the toughest of times. And so the experiences have been quite instructive. What have we learned? In no case were transmission rates for schools, kids younger than high school, as high as for the population at large. They were very low. Germany found, on a preliminary basis, that relaxing behaviors may have mattered. It appears on a preliminary basis that behaviors like mask wearing, hand washing, ventilation, social distancing, limiting the extent to which the kids mix seems to matter. In places throughout Europe, the common attitude has been that schools should be the last things to close. In Europe, schools with double-digit rates of positive test results in the community at large still kept their schools open. The big worry there is what happens when the kids go home. People actually feel better in Europe about kids being in a controlled environment, staying in school. But in the United States, the attitude is quite the opposite. We're closing schools when the infection rate, the positive test rate, is only 3%, not 10%. Why the big difference? In the United States, everything becomes politicized, including, unfortunately, COVID response, including school closures. Reopening and anti-opening factions largely cut along the same lines as pro-Trump and anti-Trump. Our two-party system is not refined sufficiently to represent the diversity of positions that can be taken on issues. Because the parties don't always align well with opposing approaches to certain problems, what you get sometimes is really nothing more than a test of loyalty to your party. Now, if you had a third party or a fourth party of real prominence, you could have one, for example, that were pro-opening without necessarily being pro-Trump. This would create an opportunity on the other side for people who are anti-Trump to find a way to be more rational than just being anti-opening because Trump or pro-opening. And perhaps a fourth party might be pro-Trump and anti-school opening. Then we would have people making each of the cases without being silenced for lack of party loyalty. Of course, getting a third party or a fourth to real prominence won't be easy. Politics has become a battleground. On one side of this battle are politicians and pundits, journalists and jurists, revisionists and regulators, who believe that the government is better able to make decisions for people than we are ourselves. On the other side of this battle are things like science, history, people like you, and people like me, and common sense. Thanks for helping me make this sense a little bit more common. Thanks for coming to take the gold pill. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more.